They thought I'd sit quietly after being kicked out of the project I created. By 9:17 a.m. that morning, their miscalculation had already destroyed their entire empire and the name on the patent, not theirs. 7 years of building something from nothing. 7 years of watching them slowly erase my name from every report, every meeting, every credit. They made one fatal mistake. They forgot I don't just write code, I write insurance policies. And when that termination notice hit my desk at 9:03 a.m., the most expensive insurance claim in tech history had already begun processing. My name is Harper West, and at 9:03 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October, I learned exactly what 7 years of loyalty was worth at NovaCore Systems. I walked into conference room B carrying the final optimization report for Project Seraph, 342 pages of technical specifications that would revolutionize orbital energy management. The weight of it felt satisfying in my hands. After months of debugging the quantum field stabilization algorithms, we'd finally cracked the efficiency problem that had been plaguing the system since inception. The room smelled like cheap coffee and the kind of tension that comes before bad news. Graham Langston sat at the head of the polished table, his silver hair perfectly styled, wearing one of those $1,000 suits that screamed, "I've never written a line of code in my life." Our new CEO, hired 8 months ago to scale the company globally. To his left sat Rebecca from HR, her laptop open, fingers hovering over keys like she was preparing to document something official. To his right, Marcus Webb from legal, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Harper, please sit," Graham said, gesturing to the chair directly across from him. Not the casual, grab a seat I was used to from team meetings. This was formal, directed. I set the report down carefully, my fingers automatically checking the USB drive in my blazer pocket. A nervous habit I'd developed over the past few months, making sure my insurance policy was still there. The small device felt warm against my fingertips. "We need to discuss your position at NovaCore," Graham continued, his voice carrying that practiced corporate neutrality that strips all humanity from devastating news. "After extensive review with the board and our legal team, we've decided that your services are no longer required." The words hit like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral. 7 years of 16-hour days. 7 years of solving problems that made other engineers quit. 7 years of watching my creation grow from a theoretical impossibility into a $450 million prototype that would change how humanity powered its expansion into space. "Your position is terminated effective immediately," Graham said, sliding a manila folder across the table. "Rebecca will explain the severance package and the confidentiality agreements you'll need to sign." I didn't touch the folder. Instead, I studied Graham's face, the slight upturn of his mouth that he probably thought was hidden, the way his eyes never quite met mine. This wasn't about performance or budget cuts. This was about ownership, about erasing my name from the project that had consumed my life. "I assume this is about the patent applications for Seraph," I said quietly. Graham's expression didn't change, but Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "The intellectual property created during your employment belongs to NovaCore Systems, as outlined in your original contract," Marcus said, his voice carefully measured. "The transition will be handled appropriately." Appropriately? As if there was anything appropriate about stealing someone's life work. "I'll need to collect my personal items," I said, standing slowly. My hand found the USB drive again, pressing it gently through the fabric of my jacket. The failover protocol I'd spent months perfecting was already running its preliminary scans, waiting for the final trigger, the moment my access credentials were revoked. "Security will escort you," Graham said, and I noticed he couldn't quite keep the satisfaction out of his voice. "Your access has been suspended as of this moment." There it was, the final condition. At 9:03 a.m., Harper West ceased to exist in the NovaCore Systems database. Every badge scan, every login attempt, every digital footprint, gone. But Graham had made one crucial mistake in his rush to erase me. He'd forgotten that I don't just write code, I write poetry. and the most beautiful poem I'd ever composed was about to execute itself. I walked to the door without looking back, my footsteps steady on the polished floor. Behind me, I heard the soft click of Rebecca's laptop as she began documenting the termination. In 14 minutes, she'd be documenting something else entirely. The elevator ride to the parking garage was quiet except for the gentle hum of the building's systems I'd helped design. Systems that knew every circuit, every protocol, every hidden subroutine that made NovaCore function. As the floors ticked by, I pulled out my phone and checked the time. 9:17 a.m. was still 14 minutes away. 14 minutes until Graham Langston learned the difference between firing an employee and declaring war on the person who built the very ground he stood on. The USB drive in my pocket felt like a loaded gun, and I was about to pull the trigger. 7 years ago, Project Seraph was nothing more than a theoretical impossibility scrawled on a whiteboard in Laboratory C, a room so forgotten that maintenance had stopped changing the burnt-out fluorescent bulbs. The equation that started it all was mine. A quantum field stabilization formula that could theoretically allow satellites to regenerate their own power systems using ambient cosmic radiation. Impossible, said Dr. Patricia Morrison, the department head at the time. The energy requirements alone would exceed anything we can generate with current technology. She was right. Of course, using conventional approaches, Seraph would have required a fusion reactor the size of a city block just to initialize the quantum field. But impossibility had always been my favorite starting point. I spent my first 18 months at NovaCore working alone in that abandoned lab, surviving on vending machine coffee and the kind of obsessive focus that comes from knowing you're solving something that could change everything. The breakthrough came at 3:47 a.m. on a Thursday in March, a recursive algorithm that could bootstrap the quantum field using the satellite's own motion through space-time as a catalyst. The prototype was crude, a collection of salvaged components and 3D printed housings that looked more like a high school science fair project than a revolutionary energy system. But when I activated it for the first time, watching the power readings climb steadily past every theoretical limit, I knew I'd built something that would outlive us all. That was when Ethan Crowley entered the picture. Fresh out of MIT with a Ph.D. in applied physics, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having failed at anything important. Ethan was assigned to my team as a junior researcher. He was brilliant, I'll give him that. But brilliance without wisdom is just a faster way to make expensive mistakes. Your approach is elegant, he said during his first week, studying my quantum field equations. But the commercial applications seem limited. Have you considered scaling this for terrestrial use? I should have seen it then, the way his mind immediately jumped to profit margins and market penetration. While I was solving the fundamental physics of orbital energy management, Ethan was already calculating how to monetize it. For the first 2 years, we worked well together. He handled the practical implementation while I focused on the theoretical framework. Project Seraph evolved from a proof of concept into a functioning prototype, then into a system sophisticated enough to power a small space station. Every breakthrough bore my fingerprints. Every innovation grew from foundations I'd laid in that forgotten laboratory. But somewhere along the way, the narrative began to change. It started small. Ethan would present our monthly progress reports to the board, and slowly, the pronoun shifted from Harper discovered to we determined to the team concluded. My name migrated from the header of technical documents to the acknowledgments section, then disappeared entirely. It's just corporate politics, I told myself. The work matters more than the credit. I was wrong. The first major betrayal came during the Phase 3 funding review. I'd spent 6 months developing the critical mass calculation algorithms that made Seraph's quantum field sustainable in deep space. Without these equations, the entire project would collapse the moment a satellite moved beyond Earth's magnetosphere. It was the theoretical heart of everything we'd built. The presentation was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. At 1:45 p.m., Ethan knocked on my office door. "Harper, I need to discuss the funding presentation," he said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar tension. "Patricia thinks it would be more effective if I handled the technical overview. You know how the board responds to Different presentation styles. Different presentation styles. As if my 7 years of experience and intimate knowledge of every system we'd built were somehow less valuable than his ability to smile and nod at the right moments. These are my algorithms, Ethan, I said quietly. I developed them. I tested them. I can present them better than anyone. Of course you can, he said. But his eyes were already focused on the presentation materials on my desk. But this is about securing funding for the entire team. We need to think strategically about who delivers the message. I watched him walk away with my research under his arm, knowing that something fundamental had shifted. The project I'd created was being quietly stolen, one presentation at a time. The funding was approved. Ethan was promoted to senior project lead. I remained a principal engineer, a title that sounded impressive but carried no real authority over the work I'd originated. By year 4, I was effectively a consultant on my own creation. Technical questions were routed through Ethan's team. Design decisions were made in meetings I wasn't invited to attend. My access to certain development servers was restricted for security purposes. The final insult came during the patent application process. Harper, we need to discuss the intellectual property documentation, said Janet Rodriguez from legal, sliding a stack of papers across my desk. Given the collaborative nature of Project Seraph, the patent applications will list multiple inventors. I scanned the documents, my heart sinking with each page. Ethan Crowley was listed as the primary inventor. Dr. Morrison appeared as a co-inventor despite having called the project impossible. My name was buried in the middle of a list of 17 contributors, as if I were just another engineer who'd made minor improvements to someone else's vision. This is wrong, I said, my voice barely controlled. I created the fundamental architecture. The quantum field equations are mine. The recursive algorithms are mine. The entire theoretical framework. I understand your concerns, Janet interrupted. But patent law requires us to document contributions objectively. The determination of primary inventorship is based on the totality of the development process, not just the initial concept. Objectively. As if 7 years of my life could be reduced to a checkbox on a legal form. I signed the papers because I had to. Because fighting would have meant lawyers I couldn't afford, and a career-ending reputation as difficult to work with. Because I still believed that doing good work mattered more than getting credit for it. But in the quiet moments between meetings, in the empty hours after midnight when I was alone with my thoughts, I began to understand something important. They weren't just stealing my work. They were erasing my existence from the story of my own creation. That was when I started building the failover protocol. Not out of anger. Anger is loud and messy and makes mistakes. Out of precision. Out of the same methodical approach I'd used to solve every engineering problem that had ever mattered. If they wanted to erase Harper West from Project Seraph, they would have to live with the consequences of that choice. Graham Langston arrived at NovaCore Systems like a hurricane in an expensive suit, bringing with him the kind of corporate transformation that destroys everything it touches while calling it optimization. His first all-hands meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Monday in February, and the entire company gathered in the main auditorium to meet the man who would take NovaCore to the next level. I've spent the last month reviewing our portfolio, Graham announced, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone who'd given this same speech at a dozen other companies. And I'm excited to report that we have a genuine unicorn in our stable. Project Seraph represents the kind of breakthrough technology that doesn't just create markets, it creates entire industries. I sat in the third row, watching him reduce 7 years of my life to a PowerPoint slide titled Revenue Opportunity, Orbital Energy Systems. The technical specifications I'd bled over were transformed into bullet points about scalable solutions and global market penetration. My quantum field equations became proprietary algorithms with significant competitive advantages. Our projections show Seraph generating $2.8 billion in revenue over the next 5 years. Graham continued, clicking to a graph that showed exponential growth curves, but only if we execute flawlessly. Only if we treat this not as a research project, but as a business imperative. That was the moment I understood what was coming. Graham wasn't interested in the science of what we'd built. He was interested in the story he could tell investors about what we'd built. And every good story needs a protagonist that the audience can connect with. Ethan Crowley, with his MIT pedigree and his natural ability to translate complex physics into investor-friendly soundbites, was perfect casting for the role of visionary genius. With my tendency to obsess over technical details and my habit of speaking in equations rather than market projections, was decidedly not. The transformation began immediately. Within 2 weeks of Graham's arrival, Ethan was promoted to Director of Advanced Systems. His office was moved to the executive floor, 3 levels above the engineering department where the actual work happened. My office remained in Laboratory C, next to the room where I'd first conceived of Project Seraph. It's about organizational efficiency, Graham explained during one of his mandatory restructuring meetings. We need clear lines of authority. Ethan will serve as the primary liaison between the technical team and executive leadership. All project communications will be routed through his office. All project communications, including the technical reports I'd been writing for 7 years, including the patent applications that bore my name, including the fundamental documentation that proved Project Seraph was my creation. I watched it happen with the same detached fascination I'd once reserved for particularly complex physics problems. Graham and Ethan moved through the company like a perfectly synchronized machine, systematically rewriting the history of everything we'd built. Meeting notes were revised, presentation materials were updated. The narrative of Project Seraph was quietly altered to position Ethan as the brilliant innovator who'd conceived of orbital energy management, with me relegated to the role of key technical contributor. The most insidious part was how reasonable it all sounded. We need to streamline our message, Graham would say. Investors don't want to hear about collaborative development processes. They want to understand the vision behind the technology. And Ethan, with his natural charisma and his ability to make quantum physics sound like common sense, was undeniably better at selling that vision than I was. But selling a vision and creating a reality are entirely different things. While Graham and Ethan were busy rebranding Project Seraph as a commercial success story, the actual system was falling apart. The first crisis came during the Phase 4 testing sequence. We'd installed a full-scale Seraph prototype on a satellite scheduled for deployment in June. And the initial power generation readings were 23% below theoretical specifications. It was the kind of problem that required deep knowledge of the quantum field equations, the kind of problem that I'd solved a dozen times before during the development process. We need to recalibrate the field harmonics, I told Ethan during the emergency meeting called to address the performance issues. The orbital mechanics are creating interference patterns that weren't present in our Earth-based testing. I can have a solution ready in 48 hours. That's not going to work, Ethan replied, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from a corner office and a direct line to the CEO. We can't afford delays. The deployment timeline is locked in. Then we deploy a system that doesn't work, I said flatly. The physics doesn't care about your timeline, Ethan. The quantum field stability equations are non-negotiable. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Admitting that he needed my expertise to fix a problem he couldn't solve himself would undermine the narrative he and Graham had constructed. Better to push forward with a flawed system than to acknowledge the limitations of his understanding. I'll have my team run additional simulations, he said finally. We'll find a solution that doesn't require major modifications to the core architecture. His team, as if the algorithms that governed Project Seraph were interchangeable components that could be optimized by anyone with sufficient processing power. The satellite deployed on schedule. The Seraph prototype failed after 6 days, exactly as I'd predicted. The official report, signed by Ethan and endorsed by Graham, attributed the failure to unexpected environmental factors and the inherent challenges of space-based technology deployment. No mention of the quantum field instability I'd identified. No acknowledgement that the failure could have been prevented with a simple recalibration. No recognition that the person who designed the system might have valuable insight into why it wasn't working. That was when I realized that Graham and Ethan weren't just stealing my work, they were destroying it. In their rush to commercialize Project Seraph, they were systematically dismantling the careful balance of theoretical physics and practical engineering that made it function. They were turning 7 years of breakthrough science into a marketing campaign, and they didn't care if the actual technology survived the process. The final insult came during the investor presentation in September. Graham had arranged for a consortium of venture capital firms to visit NovaCore and receive a comprehensive briefing on Project Seraph's commercial potential. The presentation was scheduled for the main conference room, with Ethan designated as the primary presenter. I wasn't invited to attend. 7 years of my life, reduced to a footnote in someone else's success story. But I listened from the hallway outside the conference room, my ear pressed to the door like a child eavesdropping on adult conversations. I heard Ethan describe the breakthrough moment when he'd first conceived of using cosmic radiation as a power source. I heard him explain the innovative approach he'd developed for quantum field stabilization. I heard him field technical questions with the kind of superficial confidence that comes from memorizing someone else's work without truly understanding it. And I heard Graham close the presentation with a promise that would haunt me for months. Gentlemen, what you've seen today is just the beginning. Under Ethan's leadership, we're going to revolutionize how humanity powers its expansion into space. The age of orbital energy is about to begin. And NovaCore Systems is going to own it. Own it. As if 7 years of my existence could be purchased with venture capital and rebranded as corporate vision. That night, I sat in my empty office and began writing the code that would eventually become the failover protocol. Not because I was angry, anger is a luxury I couldn't afford, because I was precise, because I understood that every system, no matter how complex, has a single point of failure. And Graham Langston, in his arrogance and his greed, had just made himself that point of failure. The first time I met Mara Gleason, she was destroying a pharmaceutical company's patent portfolio with the surgical precision of a master surgeon. I'd found her through a recommendation from a former colleague who'd whispered her name like a trade secret. If you ever need to prove you own something that someone else claims they invented, Mara's your nuclear option. Her office occupied the 32nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Seattle, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Elliott Bay. The walls were lined with law books and framed patents, each one representing a battle won against corporations that had underestimated the power of properly documented intellectual property. "Dr. West," she said, extending a hand that felt like it could crush steel. "I've read your work on quantum field stabilization. Brilliant stuff. Also, completely stolen. If what you've told me is accurate." Mara was in her 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and the kind of focused intensity that comes from spending decades fighting David versus Goliath battles in federal court. She'd built her reputation on cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch: the impossible claims, the David versus Goliath patent disputes, the situations where genius met corporate greed and needed someone willing to burn down the entire system to prove a point. "Tell me about the documentation," she said, settling behind a desk that looked like it belonged in a war room. "Everything you have, every email, every draft, every scribbled note from 7 years ago. If we're going to prove you created Project Seraph, we need to build a timeline that's absolutely unbreakable." I opened my laptop and began showing her the digital breadcrumbs I'd been collecting for months. Server logs that proved I'd been the first person to access the Laboratory C workstation where Seraph was conceived. Email threads from 2018 that showed me discussing quantum field theory with colleagues who'd later claim ignorance of the project's origins. Version control histories that documented every line of code I'd written, every algorithm I'd developed, every breakthrough I'd achieved. "This is good," Mara said, her eyes scanning through gigabytes of evidence. "But it's not enough. Corporate intellectual property law is designed to favor the employer, not the employee. We need something that proves not just that you created the technology, but that you retained some form of ownership despite their attempts to claim it." That was when I told her about the signature trap. 3 months earlier, during one of Graham's endless series of strategic alignment meetings, I'd presented him with a comprehensive technical report on Project Seraph's orbital deployment specifications. Buried on page 247 of the 300-page document, in a section titled Theoretical Framework Attribution, was a single paragraph that read, "The quantum field stabilization algorithms documented in this report represent the original theoretical work of Dr. Harper West, developed independently during the initial research phase of Project Seraph. By signing this document, NovaCore Systems acknowledges Dr. West's foundational contribution to the underlying physics that enable orbital energy management, and agrees that any patent applications derived from this work will include appropriate attribution of inventorship." Graham had signed it without reading it, just like he signed everything else, with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never bothered to understand the technical details of what his company actually produced. "Son of a bitch," Mara said, a smile spreading across her face like sunrise. "You got him to sign his own death warrant." "It gets better," I said, pulling up another document. The patent applications for Project Seraph were filed under an expedited review process that required Graham's personal authorization, which means his signature appears on every single filing, including the ones that claim Ethan Crowley as the primary inventor. Mara leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled as she processed the implications. "So we have documentary evidence that Graham acknowledged your foundational contribution to the technology. We have his signature on patent applications that deliberately exclude you from inventorship. And we have 7 years of technical documentation proving that you created every critical component of the system. That's the foundation," I said. "But the real insurance policy is something I call failover." I spent the next 2 hours explaining the protocol I'd been developing in secret for the past 6 months. Every major system at NovaCore ran through a central server farm that I'd helped design during my first year with the company. Those servers contained not just the current versions of our software, but complete archives of every development iteration, every design document, every piece of code that had ever been written for Project Seraph. More importantly, they contained the kill switches. I built failover into the core architecture of every system I've ever touched, I explained. It's not malware. It's a legitimate security protocol designed to protect intellectual property from unauthorized access. But it has some interesting features. The protocol was designed to monitor 3 specific conditions: my employment status, my access privileges, and the existence of any legal documents bearing Graham's signature that contradicted the attribution agreements he'd previously signed. When all 3 conditions were met, when I was fired, when my access was revoked, and when Graham's signature appeared on patents claiming someone else had invented my work, failover would activate automatically. "What exactly does it do?" Mara asked. "It preserves the evidence," I said. "Every piece of documentation proving that I created Project Seraph gets automatically compiled and submitted to the USPTO as a competing patent application. The submission includes not just the technical specifications, but the complete development history, the original research notes, the email threads, the version control logs, everything necessary to prove prior art and original inventorship. And it does this automatically, without any manual intervention. Completely autonomous. Once the trigger conditions are met, the system executes the filing within minutes. By the time NovaCore realizes what's happening, the patent application is already in the federal database with an official timestamp." Mara was quiet for a long moment, her legal mind working through the implications. "You realize what you're describing is corporate warfare at the highest level. If this works, it doesn't just protect your intellectual property, it destroys theirs. Every system they've built, every contract they've signed, every investor presentation they've given, it all becomes legally worthless the moment your patent application is accepted." "Good," I said, and I meant it. "They made a choice to erase me from my own creation. They can live with the consequences." She pulled out a legal pad and began sketching the timeline of events, mapping out the documentation we'd need to support the patent application. "We'll need to be surgical about this. The USPTO examiner is going to scrutinize every detail, especially if Novacore challenges the filing. We need to make sure every piece of evidence is properly authenticated, every claim is technically accurate, and every legal argument is bulletproof. I've been preparing for this for months, I said. Every document is backed up in multiple locations. Every piece of code is verified and commented. Every technical claim can be supported with independent evidence. And you're absolutely certain about the trigger mechanism? If we're going to build a legal strategy around this failover protocol, I need to know it's going to work exactly as designed. I pulled out my phone and showed her the monitoring application I'd developed. 3 status indicators: employment status, access privileges, and patent conflicts. All currently green, but designed to turn red the moment Graham made his move. The system checks these conditions every 60 seconds, I explained. The moment all 3 indicators turn red, failover begins executing. Total runtime is approximately 14 minutes from trigger to completion. 14 minutes to destroy a $450 million project. Mara mused. I've seen nuclear weapons with longer fuses. This is more precise than a nuclear weapon, I said. Nuclear weapons destroy everything. This only destroys the lies. She closed the legal pad and looked at me with the kind of respect that comes from recognizing a fellow predator. Dr. West, I've spent 30 years fighting corporate patent theft. I've seen brilliant inventors destroyed by companies that stole their work and genius reduced to footnotes in someone else's success story. But I've never seen anyone prepare for war with this level of precision. They taught me to be precise, I said. 7 years of forcing me to document every decision, every breakthrough, every failure. They thought they were protecting themselves from liability. They were actually building the evidence that would destroy them. When do you think they'll make their move? I checked my phone. The monitoring app showed all 3 indicators still green, but I could feel the momentum building. Graham's investor presentations were becoming more frequent, more aggressive. Ethan's public profile was growing as he took credit for innovations he'd never understood. The patent applications were moving through the review process, each one a step closer to making their theft permanent. Soon, I said. They're getting greedy, and greedy people make mistakes. Good, Mara said, standing up and extending her hand. Because I'm looking forward to watching them burn. The coffee at Morrison's Deli had always been terrible, but it was the kind of terrible that becomes comfortable after 7 years of routine. I sat in my usual corner booth, laptop open, watching the 3 status indicators on my screen like a predator watching prey. 9:03 a.m. had come and gone. Employment status, red. Access privileges, red. The 3rd indicator, patent conflicts, still glowed green, but I could feel it preparing to change. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. USPTO confirmation. Application 180892-347 filed successfully. Processing time, 11 minutes, 42 seconds, MG. Mara's message made me smile. 11 minutes and 42 seconds. Even faster than my most optimistic projections. I pulled up the USPTO database on my laptop and searched for application 18.892-347. There it was, time-stamped at 9:17 a.m. Quantum Field Stabilization System for Orbital Energy Management by Dr. Harper West. The abstract was my original work, written in my own words, describing the theoretical framework I'd developed in that forgotten laboratory 7 years ago. The supporting documentation was comprehensive. 847 pages of technical specifications, development notes, email correspondence, and version control logs. Every algorithm was attributed to its original author. Every breakthrough was documented with precise timestamps. Every claim was supported by independently verifiable evidence. But the most beautiful part was the legal framework Mara had constructed around the technical content. The patent application didn't just claim ownership of the quantum field stabilization technology. It systematically demolished every argument Novacore could make about collaborative development or corporate intellectual property rights. Exhibit A. The signature trap from Graham's technical report, proving that Novacore had officially acknowledged my foundational contribution to the work. Exhibit B, the complete development timeline, showing that every critical innovation in Project Seraph had originated from my research, with subsequent team members making only minor modifications to the core architecture. Exhibit C, the patent applications filed by NovaCore, bearing Graham's signature and falsely claiming Ethan Crowley as the primary inventor. In direct contradiction to the attribution agreements Graham had previously signed, the case was airtight. More than airtight, it was mathematically perfect, like a proof in theoretical physics where every variable cancels out to reveal an elegant truth. I closed the laptop and leaned back in the booth, savoring the moment. In the span of 14 minutes, I'd gone from unemployed engineer to patent holder of a technology worth nearly $500 million. More importantly, I'd transformed Graham's moment of corporate triumph into the beginning of his professional destruction. My phone rang. The caller ID showed NovaCore Systems, main line. Dr. West? The voice was unfamiliar, strained. This is David Kim from NovaCore's legal department. We need to speak with you immediately about a very urgent matter. I'm having coffee, I said calmly. But I suppose I have time to talk. What's the urgent matter? There's been some kind of technical issue. Our servers are showing that certain Project Seraph files have been compromised. We're also receiving reports of unauthorized patent applications filed under your name. Unauthorized, as if I needed permission to patent my own work. I'm not sure what you mean by unauthorized, I said. I filed a patent application for technology I developed. That seems fairly routine. Dr. West, you signed confidentiality agreements. You assigned your intellectual property rights to NovaCore Systems. This patent application is a clear violation of your contractual obligations. Actually, David, I think you'll find that Graham Langston signed a document acknowledging my foundational contribution to the quantum field stabilization technology. You might want to review page 247 of the technical report he approved in July. Silence on the other end of the line. I could hear papers shuffling, computer keys clicking, the sound of a legal department realizing they'd been outmaneuvered. We need to meet, David said finally. This situation requires immediate resolution. I agree, I said. But I should mention that I'm represented by Mara Gleason of Gleason & Associates. All communications regarding this matter should be directed through her office. Another pause. David Kim obviously knew Mara's reputation. Dr. West, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the nature of your contributions to Project Seraph. Perhaps we could discuss a reasonable accommodation. There's no misunderstanding, I interrupted. I created the quantum field stabilization algorithms. I developed the theoretical framework. I built the prototype. I solved every major technical challenge the project encountered, and I have 7 years of documentation proving all of this. But surely you understand that this was collaborative work, that the project involved multiple team members, multiple perspectives. Yes, it did. Other people made contributions. But the fundamental innovation, the breakthrough that made orbital energy management possible, was mine. And your CEO signed a document acknowledging that fact. I could hear David's breathing, the sound of someone trying to find a legal foothold on ground that had already shifted beneath him. What do you want? He asked finally. I want what was always mine, I said. Recognition, attribution, the right to control the technology I created. That's not possible. The commercial applications, the investor commitments, the development timeline are all based on stolen work, I finished. And now you're going to discover what happens when the foundation of your empire turns out to be built on sand. I hung up and ordered another coffee, settling in to watch the chaos unfold. The terrible coffee at Morrison's Deli had never tasted so good. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Graham Langston himself. Harper. His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the panic underneath. We need to talk, face to face. This situation has gotten out of hand. Has it? I asked. Because from where I'm sitting, everything seems to be working exactly as intended. You're destroying the company. 7 years of work, hundreds of millions in investment, dozens of jobs. I'm destroying the lies, I said. The company built on my stolen work was never real to begin with. Name your price, Graham said. We can work this out. License fees, royalty agreements, consulting contracts, whatever it takes. You had your chance to work it out, I said. You could have included my name on the patent applications. You could have acknowledged my contributions. You could have treated me like the inventor I actually was, instead of an inconvenient employee who knew too much. Harper, be reasonable. I am being reasonable, I said. Perfectly reasonable. I filed a patent application for technology I created. I documented my work. I followed all the proper procedures. What's unreasonable is spending 7 years stealing someone's life work and then acting surprised when they take it back. The patent office will never approve this. We'll challenge it. We'll fight it in court. We have resources you can't imagine. Fight it with what? I asked. The falsified patent applications Graham signed, the technical documentation that proves I created every critical component, the email threads showing how you systematically erased my contributions. Silence. You made one mistake, Graham. I continued. You assumed that because you had power, you could rewrite history. But history is written in code, and I wrote all the code. I hung up and checked my monitoring application one final time. All 3 indicators glowed red now, like warning lights on a system that had already failed catastrophically. The failover protocol had executed perfectly. In 14 minutes, I'd reclaimed 7 years of my life and destroyed the empire built on its theft. The quantum field stabilization technology was mine again, protected by federal patent law and supported by documentation that even Graham's lawyers couldn't challenge. But the real victory wasn't legal or financial. It was the knowledge that somewhere in a glass tower across the city, the people who'd tried to erase me from existence were finally learning that some things can't be stolen, only borrowed temporarily, until the original owner decides to take them back. The silence lasted exactly 43 minutes. I sat in Morrison's deli, watching the steam rise from my 3rd cup of terrible coffee. When the first sign of chaos arrived, my phone buzzed with a LinkedIn notification. Ethan Crowley has updated his profile. Curious. I opened the app to find that his job title had changed from Director of Advanced Systems to simply Director, and his bio no longer mentioned Project Seraph. The second sign came 5 minutes later. A text from my former colleague Sarah Martinez. What the hell did you do? They just locked down the entire engineering floor. Nobody can access the Seraph development servers. I smiled, remembering the elegant simplicity of the data protection protocols I'd embedded in every system I'd touched. When the failover sequence activated, it hadn't just filed my patent application, it had systematically quarantined every piece of Project Seraph documentation, every line of code, every technical specification. The data wasn't destroyed, but it was encrypted with keys that only I possessed, sealed behind security barriers that would take months to crack. From Novacore's perspective, their most valuable asset had simply vanished. My phone rang. The caller ID showed Novacore Systems, Graham Langston. You have to stop this. Graham's voice was raw, desperate. Our investors are pulling out. The stock price is in free fall. We have contractual obligations. You have nothing, I interrupted. The technology you promised your investors doesn't belong to you. It never did. Harper, listen to me. I'll give you anything you want. Chief Technology Officer, equity stake, your name on every patent application. Just unlock the servers. I can't do that, Graham. The failover protocol is autonomous. Once activated, it follows its programming to completion. That was partially true. The system could be stopped, but only through a complex sequence of commands that I had no intention of sharing. Graham didn't need to know that his empire was crumbling by my choice rather than by inevitability. Then work with us, he pleaded. Help us find a solution. We can still make this work. I hung up and walked to the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline. Somewhere in that forest of glass and steel, the Novacore Systems building was experiencing its own version of nuclear winter. Emergency meetings were being called. Lawyers were being consulted. Engineers were staring at blank screens, trying to understand how 7 years of work could disappear in 14 minutes. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from a number I didn't recognize. Dr. West, this is James Patterson from Venture Dynamics. We were the lead investor in Novacore's Series C funding round. I recognized the name. Venture Dynamics had pumped $40 million into Novacore 6 months ago, based largely on projections about Project Seraph's commercial potential. Mr. Patterson, I said. I assume you're calling about the patent situation. I'm calling about the complete collapse of our investment, he said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that comes from losing enormous amounts of money. Our due diligence team is telling us that the core technology we funded doesn't legally belong to Novacore. They're saying it belongs to you. That's correct. Dr. West, I want you to understand something. We invested $40 million based on representations that Novacore owned the intellectual property for orbital energy management. If those representations were false, we have significant legal recourse. Against Novacore, I said. Not against me. I never made any representations to your investment committee. But you could resolve this situation. You could license the technology back to Novacore, allow them to fulfill their contractual obligations. I could. I agreed. But why would I want to do that? Because the alternative is watching dozens of brilliant engineers lose their jobs. Because the alternative is seeing groundbreaking technology locked away in legal disputes instead of changing the world. I considered this. James Patterson was right about the collateral damage. There were people at Novacore who'd had nothing to do with stealing my work but would suffer the consequences anyway. But there were also people who'd stood by silently while my contributions were erased, who'd benefited from my innovations while allowing me to be marginalized. Mr. Patterson, let me ask you something. During your due diligence process, did anyone mention that the primary inventor of the quantum field stabilization technology wasn't listed on the patent applications? Silence. Did anyone tell you that the theoretical framework enabling orbital energy management was developed by someone who'd been systematically excluded from the project leadership? More silence. Did anyone think to verify that the people claiming credit for the breakthrough actually understood the physics involved? Our technical advisors reviewed the documentation, Patterson said weakly. Documentation that had been sanitized to remove my contributions, I said. Documentation that presented a false narrative about how the technology was developed. What do you want? He asked finally. I want what I've always wanted. Recognition, attribution, the right to control the technology I created. And if we arrange that, if we can convince Novacore to acknowledge your contributions, to restructure the patent applications, to give you the credit you deserve? I laughed, a sound that came out harsher than I'd intended. Mr. Patterson, you're talking about convincing a company to admit they built their entire business model on stolen intellectual property. You're talking about Graham Langston publicly acknowledging that his greatest success was actually someone else's achievement. You're talking about Ethan Crowley confessing that he's been taking credit for innovations he never understood. People have admitted to worse things when enough money was at stake. Maybe, I said. But I'm not interested in their apologies. I'm interested in justice. Justice doesn't pay salaries, Patterson said. Justice doesn't fund research. Justice doesn't advance the cause of human space exploration. You're right, I said. But neither does theft. And that's what you funded, Mr. Patterson. You gave $40 million to a company that built its core technology on stolen work. Your investment was based on lies from the beginning. The line went quiet except for the sound of Patterson's breathing. I could imagine him sitting in his office, surrounded by charts showing the trajectory of his investment as it cratered towards zero. There might be another way, he said finally. What if we bypassed Novacore entirely? What if Venture Dynamics invested directly in your technology? We could structure a deal that gives you complete control over the intellectual property, full attribution, and the resources to develop orbital energy management on your own terms. Now that was interesting. I'd been so focused on destroying the empire built on my stolen work that I hadn't fully considered what would come after. The patent application gave me legal ownership of the technology. But turning that ownership into actual progress would require resources I didn't have. I'm listening, I said. We could set up a new company. Patterson continued, his voice gaining energy as he saw a path forward. Clean slate, your technology, your vision, your team. We provide the funding, you provide the innovation, the way it should have been from the beginning. I looked out at the Seattle skyline again, imagining a different future. Not the revenge fantasy I'd been living in for the past few hours, but something constructive. Something that would honor the 7 years I'd spent developing quantum field stabilization by actually using it to change the world. I'll consider it, I said. But first, I want to watch Novacore finish collapsing. I want to see Graham Langston explain to his board how he built a $400 million company on stolen technology. I want to see Ethan Crowley try to solve technical problems he never understood. And after that, we'll talk about building something new, something honest, something that puts the inventor's name on the patent applications where it belongs. I hung up and ordered another coffee, settling in for what promised to be a very entertaining afternoon. The terrible coffee at Morrison's Deli had never tasted so much like victory. The offer came at 2:47 p.m., delivered by a courier who looked like he'd been instructed to wait for my response. Inside the manila envelope was a check for $10 million, made out to Dr. Harper West and signed by Graham Langston himself. The accompanying letter was brief, typed on Novacore letterhead, and reeked of desperation. Dr. West. This payment represents our offer to purchase the quantum field stabilization patent referenced in USPTO application 18.892-347. Upon your acceptance and endorsement of this check, all rights to the technology will transfer to Novacore Systems, and you will provide the decryption keys necessary to restore access to Project Seraph development systems. We believe this represents fair compensation for your contributions to the project. Sincerely, Graham Langston, Chief Executive Officer. I held the check up to the light streaming through Morrison's Deli window, admiring the watermark and the precise machine printing that made $10 million look so ordinary. Fair compensation. As if 7 years of my life could be reduced to a single transaction. The courier shifted nervously. I was instructed to wait for your response. Dr. West? I folded the check carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket, next to the USB drive that had started this entire sequence of events. Tell Mr. Langston that I'll consider his offer. The courier nodded and hurried away, probably eager to escape the cafe that had become the epicenter of Novacore's destruction. My phone buzzed with a text from Mara. Novacore stock down 67% since market open. Trading suspended pending investigation. Beautiful work. I pulled up the financial news on my laptop, watching the real-time coverage of what reporters were calling the fastest corporate collapse in tech history. The headlines were brutal. Novacore Systems faces patent crisis as core technology ownership disputed. Venture capital firm demands immediate audit of Novacore IP claims. Project Seraph development halted as legal questions mount. But the most satisfying article was a technical analysis piece that had been published 20 minutes ago. Quantum Field Stabilization, the physics behind the patent dispute. The author, Dr. Tsarars, Rebecca Martinez from Stanford's Applied Physics Department, had done her homework. She'd analyzed my patent application, compared it to the technical specifications Novacore had published, and reached an unambiguous conclusion. The fundamental innovations belonged to me. The quantum field equations documented in Dr. West's patent application represent genuine breakthrough physics. The article stated, the recursive algorithms she developed for orbital energy management are not incremental improvements to existing technology. They are revolutionary innovations that enable previously impossible applications. Any honest assessment of the technical documentation makes it clear that Dr. West is the primary inventor of this technology. Primary inventor. The words I'd been waiting 7 years to see in print. My phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. West, this is Lisa Zhang from Asterion Technologies. I knew the name. Asterion was one of the largest aerospace contractors in the world, with divisions focused on satellite development, space exploration, and emerging energy technologies. They'd been watching Project Seraph's development for years, probably waiting for Novacore to stumble so they could acquire the technology. Ms. Zhang, I said. I assume you're calling about the patent situation. I'm calling about the future, she said. Our technical teams have been analyzing your patent application, and we're impressed, not just with the technology, but with the precision of your documentation. It's clear you understand both the theoretical physics and the practical implementation challenges. I developed both. We'd like to offer you a position as our Chief Technology Officer, full creative control over a new orbital energy division, unlimited research budget, your own team of engineers, your own facilities, your own timeline. I leaned back in the booth, processing the offer. CTO of a major aerospace company. The kind of position that would give me the resources to turn 7 years of theoretical work into actual spacecraft, actual orbital installations, actual progress toward humanity's expansion into space. What about the patent situation? I asked. We're prepared to license the quantum field stabilization technology from you directly. Fair market rate, with provisions for ongoing royalty payments as we develop commercial applications. And if Novacore challenges the patent? We have excellent lawyers, Lisa said. And from what we've seen, your documentation is bulletproof. If they want to fight this in court, they'll be fighting both of us. I thought about Graham's $10 million check, still folded in my pocket. $10 million to make this problem go away. To let him continue claiming credit for my work. To return to the status quo where Harper West was a footnote in someone else's success story. I'm interested, I said. But I want to see how this plays out first. Of course. But Dr. West, I want you to know that we're not just offering you a job. We're offering you the chance to revolutionize how humanity powers its presence in space. The quantum field stabilization technology could enable permanent orbital installations, deep space exploration missions, even interplanetary colonization. I know, I said. I designed it for exactly those applications. Then you know what's at stake here. This isn't just about patents and corporate politics. This is about the future of human space exploration. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet cafe, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor. The check in my pocket felt heavier now, weighted with the knowledge of what accepting it would mean. Graham wasn't just offering to buy my technology, he was offering to buy my silence, my complicity in the theft of my own work. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from a number I recognized, Sarah Martinez, my former colleague from the engineering department. Harper, what have you done? Her voice was strained, exhausted. The entire department is in chaos. They've locked down all the development systems. Nobody can access anything. I protected my work, I said simply. Your work? Harper, this was a team effort. There are dozens of people who contributed to Project Seraph. You're destroying their careers along with yours. I'm not destroying anyone's career, I said. I'm preventing the theft of intellectual property. The people who actually contributed to the project will be credited appropriately. And what about the people who didn't contribute directly but whose jobs depend on the project's success? What about the technicians, the support staff, the administrators? They're all being laid off because of what you've done. I felt a stab of guilt. Sarah was right. There were innocent people caught in the crossfire of my war with Graham and Ethan. But there had also been innocent people watching while my contributions were systematically erased, while my name was removed from the work I'd created. Sarah, I tried to resolve this quietly. I asked for proper attribution. I requested that my name be included on the patent applications. I was told it wasn't the right time, that it would be handled later, that corporate politics required a different approach. So you decided to burn everything down instead. I decided to reclaim what was mine, I said. And if that means some people lose jobs at a company built on stolen technology, maybe they should have spoken up when the stealing was happening. You're being selfish, Sarah said. You're putting your ego ahead of the greater good. No, I said. I'm putting truth ahead of convenience. The greater good isn't served by allowing brilliant innovations to be stolen and rebranded. The greater good isn't served by letting corporations erase the contributions of their employees. And what happens now? Do you really think this technology will ever see the light of day if it's tied up in legal disputes for years? I thought about Lisa Zhang's offer, about the possibility of building something new and honest with people who understood the value of proper attribution. It'll see the light of day, I said, just not under Novacore's name. Harper, they're offering $10 million. Take the money and move on. Start your own company. Build something new. They offered me $10 million to pretend that stealing my work was acceptable, I said. That's not the same thing. I hung up and pulled the check out of my pocket, studying Graham's signature. $10 million. More money than I'd ever imagined having. Enough to disappear, to start over somewhere new, to pretend that the past 7 years had never happened. I tore the check in half, then in half again, letting the pieces fall onto the table like confetti. The terrible coffee at Morrison's Deli had never tasted so much like freedom. 1 month later, I walked through the glass doors of Novacore Systems for the final time. The building felt different, quieter, emptier, like a museum dedicated to corporate hubris. The security guard at the front desk looked up with recognition and something that might have been respect. "Dr. West," he said, nodding. "They're expecting you in Laboratory C." I took the elevator to the 3rd floor, my footsteps echoing in hallways that had once buzzed with the energy of innovation. Most of the engineering department had been laid off. The remaining staff moved through the corridors like ghosts, processing the paperwork of dissolution. Laboratory C was exactly as I'd left it 7 years ago. The same flickering fluorescent lights. The same forgotten corner where impossibility had become reality. Someone had cleaned out the workstation, but the whiteboard still held faint traces of the equations I'd scrawled there during those first breakthrough months. On the desk sat a single item, a small brass nameplate reading, Dr. Harper West, Principal Engineer. The nameplate I'd removed from my office door when I'd been escorted out by security. Someone had saved it, kept it safe through the chaos of the past month. I picked up the nameplate and ran my fingers over the engraved letters. Dr. Harper West. Not key contributor or team member or any of the other euphemisms they'd used to minimize my role. Just my name, in clean, honest type. Next to the nameplate was a USB drive, empty, freshly formatted, with a yellow sticky note attached. For next time, M.G. I smiled, recognizing Mara's handwriting. She'd been busy in the weeks since the failover protocol executed, negotiating the terms of Novacore's dissolution, ensuring that every engineer who'd been laid off received proper severance, making sure that Graham Langston's corporate empire collapsed with surgical precision rather than explosive destruction. The patent dispute had been resolved in my favor, as we'd known it would be. The documentation was too comprehensive, the evidence too overwhelming. The USPTO had awarded me primary inventorship of the quantum field stabilization technology, with appropriate attribution to the engineers who'd made legitimate contributions to the project's development. Graham Langston had resigned in disgrace, his reputation destroyed by the revelation that his greatest business success had been built on stolen intellectual property. Ethan Crowley had disappeared from the tech industry entirely. His LinkedIn profile deleted, his professional existence erased as thoroughly as he'd tried to erase mine. But the most satisfying outcome was what had grown from the ashes of their deception. Asterion Technologies had moved quickly, establishing a new division focused on orbital energy management and offering positions to every Novacore engineer who'd been displaced by the company's collapse. The quantum field stabilization technology was already being integrated into next-generation satellite systems, with the first commercial deployment scheduled for early next year. I'd accepted Lisa Zhang's offer to serve as Chief Technology Officer, but on my own terms. The new division would operate with complete technical autonomy, unlimited research funding, and a corporate culture that valued innovation over politics. Most importantly, every patent application would include proper attribution. Every technical achievement would be credited to its actual creator. And no engineer would ever have to watch their work be stolen and rebranded. The nameplate fit perfectly in my jacket pocket, next to the space where the USB drive had lived for so many months. I took one last look around Laboratory C, remembering the excitement of those first breakthrough moments, the satisfaction of solving problems that had seemed impossible. Then I walked to the elevator, past the empty offices and abandoned workstations, through the lobby where Graham Langston's portrait had already been removed from the wall. The security guard nodded as I passed, and I stepped out into the Seattle afternoon, leaving behind the building where Harper West had been erased and walking toward the future where she would be remembered. On the sidewalk, I pulled out my phone and sent a single text to Mara. Package retrieved. Ready to build something honest. Her response came immediately. The future belongs to the people who create it. Go create. I looked up at the NovaCore building one final time, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun like a memorial to corporate arrogance. Then I turned and walked away, toward the car that would take me to Asterion Technologies, toward the laboratory where quantum field stabilization would finally fulfill its promise, toward the future that Graham Langston had tried to steal but never actually owned. The nameplate in my pocket felt warm, like a promise kept. Dr. Harper West. Principal Engineer. The title I'd earned, the recognition I'd claimed, the truth that had survived 7 years of systematic theft and emerged stronger than ever. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. It's building something so beautiful, so honest, and so revolutionary that it makes the lies look pathetic by comparison. The quantum field stabilization technology would change how humanity expanded into space, one properly attributed patent at a time. And every time someone looked up at the orbital installations that would one day power our civilization's reach toward the stars, they'd see my name in the technical documentation, exactly where it belonged. Thank you for listening to this story of corporate revenge, intellectual justice, and the power of precise preparation. I hope Harper's journey resonated with anyone who's ever had their work stolen, their contributions minimized, or their name erased from their own achievements. Please let me know in the comments where you're listening to this story from. I'd love to connect with fellow readers around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts about workplace justice, intellectual property rights, and the satisfaction of a perfectly executed plan. Your engagement helps stories like this reach people who need to hear them most.